Welcome to this episode of The Wolf and the Shepherd. Today we're going to be talking about men in skirts. And of course, this is not a podcast that is devoted to the Robin Hood men in tights. We're not talking about that. And we're also not talking about our friends over in Scotland who wear kilts, because let's be honest, those are not skirts, those are kilts. And I actually have a kilt, and we're not going to go there. We're actually going to talk more about how maybe the way that everybody is kind of looking at men now has changed over time. That definition of what a man is, what men are supposed to be, especially in this wonderful 21st century that we live in.
Yeah, I chose this topic because over the last few years, I feel that the role of men has been challenged. It's certainly changed in terms of how they're portrayed in advertisements and in movies. And it's almost like a sin now to want to be a strong man, to fulfill those traditional roles. And
I think sin is a good word there. It's looked down upon for some reason. Something happened not all that long ago that made it to where if you're not in touch with your feelings, if you're not a man's man, all of a sudden that's a bad thing. And it never was a bad thing. It was always a good thing. Now it's a bad thing, and it's constantly attacked.
Yeah, I never thought, that song from the 80s, It's Raining Men, would later on become a disparaging song, that women were no longer celebrating that it was raining men.
True.
But I looked up the definition of, a man on the Oxford Dictionary, Merriam-Webster, and the most common definition I found, well, at least the initial definition, is an adult male human being, which I always thought that's what a man is, right? But there's been later additions now to, I guess, qualify that statement or quantify that statement, that it's a human being of either sex.
Either sex.
Well,
okay.
I mean, you can go back and look at the Bible, and where it says man, really it's talking about everybody type of thing, like
humankind.
Humankind,
right.
Mankind, etc. Or man, God gave this to man. It's really talking about man and woman.
Sure.
So I can understand it from that point of view, but I think the additions now, when they say about being of either sex, is genuinely meaning about either sex, and not in like a I guess a collective type thing.
Makes sense.
And I think you look at all the uproar which has gone on about using the term, policeman or fireman. It should be fireperson or police person.
So the gender specific terms.
Gender roles.
Chairman of the board.
Right.
Or congressman.
Yeah.
Versus congresswoman or congressperson. All that good stuff. That, like you say, policeman, fireman, that was just these traditional held words that now we have to make them gender neutral or even gender specific and say policewoman, policeman, firewoman, fireman, congresswoman, congressman, versus just using a blanket term to encompass everybody as far as mankind.
Yeah, I never thought there would come a time when I would actually have to try and guess the gender of anybody over the age of 18 months old.
Right. That does make sense. Makes total sense.
Yeah. And, looking further into definitions, I decided to look at masculinity. And again, the Oxford Dictionary, which is very close to the Merriam-Webster definition, came up with qualities or attributes as characteristics of men, which I thought was pretty fair. I mean, masculinity, this is what men do, this is how men act. I thought that one was actually fair. Now, in the definition of a man, that one got a little bit fluffy. Okay. But masculinity, it kind of, I think it actually defined that one pretty well.
No, I think they did a good job there. And even looking back at the way they define man or men or masculinity or whatever, we all have these upheld traditional roles as far as what a man is supposed to do. And of course, we're also kind of talking about the American man, right?
Yeah.
So there's these traditional roles that a man is supposed to fulfill.
Right.
And so if you look kind of back, this is kind of way back, right? You've got the hunter. He's going out, he's killing animals to be able to feed his family.
Right.
He's providing for the family. But once we got past the necessity of being a hunter, when we had grocery stores and butcher shops and all that good stuff, as we progressed along with technology and all that good stuff, right? Then it became more of the provider role. So it was still, the old saying of bringing home the bacon.
Right.
Whether it was actually bringing home the bacon or the bacon became a what do you want to call it?
Well, it's a euphemism for money.
A euphemism. There you go. A
Yeah.
euphemism for money. They're bringing
Yeah.
home the bacon. They're putting the food on the table.
Yeah.
It's always been they're putting the food on the table. They're keeping the roof over the head and they're putting the food on the table. And they also made sure that their family was protected.
Right.
They made sure that they were out of harm's way, kind of that same roof over the head, but it was also, back in the old days to protect from animals that might come in, so you're not living in a tent, right? You have protection from the elements, you have protection from nature, all that good stuff. And because of all this, they were the head of the household. They were the ones that set the rules. And they said, here's the rules, you follow the rules, and there's no arguments here on the rules. There's no bending the rules. These are the rules.
Right.
But something happened.
Yeah. I think, going back to the last point of the definition of masculinity, what I missed when I first read through that definition was that can be interpreted so many ways depending on nowadays what you think the roles of a man are. It's now become very fluid. It's like almost, it might be considered, equal on every part for those last things you mentioned in terms of the provider and protector and the head of the household. Now it's more about joint decision making. In terms of protector, I think, it doesn't matter how much equality people strive for, the man's always going to be the one going out there with the baseball bat in the backyard when they hear a noise at night.
Sure. For the most part.
Yeah.
Let's be honest, for the most part.
And generally society, again, it doesn't matter how much, feminism is out there. If you have a couple, whether it's just boyfriend, girlfriend, or they're married, that, if the woman works and the man doesn't, that is generally frowned upon. Whereas the other way around, that's quite a common occurrence in terms of the women, the woman bringing up the children, or even if she doesn't have children, being, I guess, what was traditionally called a housewife. But the other way round, it's very frowned upon if a man doesn't have a job but just does stuff around the house, and the woman is the person who is the main wage earner. So although, this push towards equality, has been going on. I can't remember when the women's liberation and feminism movement started and when they started burning the bras and all that stuff. Some of them shouldn't. Some of them should have kept them on. I think, there are still roles that women, regardless of how much of a feminist they call themselves, they have certain roles they expect men to play when it comes down to it.
Yes, absolutely. And you can take away all of the more, if you want to call it, forward thinking, right? There's always going to be that opportunity where if you have we'll use the term traditional household, right? And you got a man and a woman in there, male and female. No matter what relationship they're in, if there's a noise outside, it's typically the woman telling the man, like you said, go outside with the baseball bat and see what's going on. You're always going to have that. But now we've approached this point to where that defender, that strong individual that is protecting everybody, that's defending everybody, is now being frowned on. It's now looked at as if you are this strong alpha male, you grunt, you like to play football, you got hair on your chest and everything, something's wrong with you. You're not the definition of what the modern man should be. And I think media has a little bit to do with that. Society, culture, it all has to do with that. And now it's more acceptable to kind of be that kind, compassionate, sensitive is a big word. Things like that we somehow got away from. And now, if you have a guy like that, they're looked down on. They're literally just looked down on. They're Neanderthals.
Yeah,
would be a good way to put it. They are true Neanderthals with that.
Yeah, and I don't disagree with that. Men should be possibly more, sensitive, accepting, and probably bend a little away from some of the traditional roles coming from the 50s and the 60s of their expectations on women. That, men should be more sensitive to the aspirations of women and accept them more in society. That when, because there are a lot of driven, successful women out there who are kick ass, they
absolutely
do some great stuff. I mean, look at, some of the people we have in politics, the press secretary. I mean, that woman, I would hate to get in a 2-second argument with her because she would kick my butt.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's not an attack on women. And I think that whole toxic masculinity argument tends to go to the point that the mansplaining or things like that. No man wants to turn around and try to attack a strong woman, a woman that's out there and doing what she can do to support herself, her family. Maybe she was married and lost her husband and she's raising kids and she's providing for her family. It's not really about that. It's about that attack on the man that actually is going out there and trying to take care of his family and trying to be the provider and trying to be the strong person. And then because of the attitude, I guess would be the word to use, he gets attacked. And I hate to say it's not fair because that just sounds like a weak argument. Oh, this isn't fair. I'm being treated unfairly, because honestly, that's a product of the toxic masculinity. If you look at it that way, people would be able to say, well, now you're kind of going more to the point of shrinking that spectrum from the masculine to the feminine side, and you're moving more towards the middle, if that spectrum does exist. It's all about fairness. It's all about feelings or whatever. So you end up in that point to where you're fighting a losing battle.
Yeah.
You're fighting a losing battle.
And I think one of the common misconceptions that comes up when you start talking about this topic is that you're trying to put women back in their place, but this is absolutely the opposite. I absolutely applaud strong women. I agree with women's rights. I want women to achieve as much as they can achieve without barriers. My point on this topic is with the men who have been bullied into being less than men,
sure,
who have taken a step back because they're now scared to be men. And you mentioned toxic masculinity, which passed a few years ago. Obviously, none of us had heard that term.
Right.
And it really, there's not much synergy in those words, because masculinity in itself is not, you wouldn't think would be a bad thing,
Sure.
But, you put the word toxic in front of it. And it's a weird thing. It's like putting the word toxic in front of the word dog, toxic dog. It doesn't really make much sense, because it starts accusing masculinity as a whole as being a bad thing, but then it starts dividing up certain traits of masculinity. And like you mentioned again, the word mansplaining, which again, a few years ago, I'd never heard of. But, I think, I'll go with the definition I found online. I think this is the best way to explain toxic masculinity.
Sure.
It says that the concept of toxic masculinity is used in academic and media, which is where you'd expect it,
right,
discussions of masculinity to refer to certain cultural norms, however you decide to describe those, that are associated with harm to society and to men themselves. Now, that's a very kind of subjective type of viewpoint, as in what somebody might consider toxic. Other people is, well, that's that. You know, I mean, it's not something which most people would get offended by. You know, it's like opening a door for a female. You know, in the South here, we do it without thought, and the vast majority of women, they're very grateful for it. But I've done that up in the Northeast, and I've had funny looks. I've had women tell me I can open the door myself.
Oh,
and
I
it's
have
like,
too.
you know, and I mean, it's ridiculous. But down here in the South, that's just common courtesy. But, you know, I open the door for men as much as I do for women.
Well, and that's one thing in the South that we do. And you can call it common courtesy, you can call it chivalry, whatever you want to call it. It's a difference even in the American culture, depending on where you're at. And like you say, in the North, very good friend of mine, a woman who is a branch manager of a company that is tending more towards kind of a male-dominated company. But I always joke with her that she's kind of more of a man than most of them.
Right.
She's, you know, a hardcore. She does her job well. But when I go up there and I open the door for her, it almost drives her nuts.
Sure.
She's not used to it. She's used to, like you say, grabbing the door handle herself. You know, and going back to the whole South thing, you know, if we open a door and we kind of look back behind us and we see somebody coming, what do? We hold the door for them.
Right.
And we've always done that.
And it doesn't matter if it's male or female. I mean,
Right.
9 times out of 10, it's the
doesn't.
male who opens the door and leaves it open for me. And I always say, thanks, man. You know?
And you led that in perfectly. So we hold the door for somebody, and then we always say thank you.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, thanks. You know,
Yeah.
or thank you, or whatever, appreciate it.
Yeah.
You know, whatever. And that is faded away in so many aspects of the American culture now.
Yeah.
And I guess you call it common courtesy. It's that maybe Southern hospitality, but would be another way to look at it.
Right.
That we just, that's how we were raised.
Yeah.
Especially in Texas. I mean, it's kind of the same with taking a hat off.
Yeah.
In a restaurant.
Uh-huh.
My wife knows that if I see somebody wearing a hat in a restaurant, it drives me insane to see somebody sitting at a table eating dinner with a hat on.
Well, you see, I have to keep mine on because I shave my head and my head gets so shiny.
But
I'm afraid the lights are going to shine on my head and blind people from eating the meal.
Well, yeah, you're doing all of us a favor with that. But I got into an argument up in the North because there was somebody sitting at a table with a hat on, and I almost refused to eat because he had a hat on.
Wow.
And we were in a nice restaurant.
Yeah.
And they finally had to explain to him, look, Max is from the South. This is what they do in the South. They do not wear a hat at the table. You just don't do it. And that's why he's mad. That's why he's looking at you like he wants to come over and punch you in the face. And maybe that's a little bit of toxic masculinity. I don't know, but you know, that's how I was raised. You walk into a building, you take your hat off.
Yeah.
That's what you do.
Yeah, I mean, that's similar to, you know, it's not like a science. It's, you know, if you're in church, you know, for the majority. Well, I mean, now it's a little bit different. You'll find kids who will wear, you know, a baseball cap in church or whatever.
Oh,
but
I've
for the
seen
most
it.
part, they don't. But I mean, it's like, you know, you take your hat off, your cap off for when the national anthem comes on.
Right.
It's not a hard and fast rule, you know, but it's just a point of respect that you follow. Now, in a restaurant, I'll be honest with you that I can't say that ever bothers me. You know, I keep my hat on anyway. I don't think for, you know, one reason or the other, but we have certain quirks. You know, I had growing up in England where, you know, the whole concept of the English gentleman, you know, in terms of opening a door and all these other things, which again are very common in the South, but not so much again when you go, you know, to the coasts here or you go up in the Northeast. And I actually had a friend, because I used to live in the Northeast for a while before I moved down to Texas. And, I had a friend who eventually he refused to open the door for women just because 50% of the time
Really?
or so he just got such disparaging remarks aimed at him that, he'd open the door for guys, leave the door open behind him for guys, but he just got tired of, remarks from women, just being negative towards them just for trying to be polite, which you do for guys. It's not a case of saying, hey, you're a weak female, you can't open the door. It's polite.
Yeah.
I'd do it for a dog. Yeah, it doesn't matter.
Well, it depends on the dog.
Well,
I wouldn't do it for a cat.
I wouldn't do it for Chihuahua.
No.
Those small dogs can stay outside and yap.
Yeah, absolutely. That's all they're good for. So, going back to that, so one thing, and we're going to get a little bit controversial here. We're not going to try to be controversial. But on top of all the toxic masculinity talk and everything is, it seems now that being a straight white male is the worst thing you can be now.
Right.
There is no winning anything. If you are white and straight and male, you're the bottom of the totem pole.
Yeah.
And there's probably some implied controversy even saying you're the bottom of the totem pole there.
Right.
It's extremely difficult, and we're not trying to discountenance any kind of struggles that any kind of ethnicities have had or any kind of women have had over the years, but now we can't even open our mouths, voice our opinions, everything. We can't say, here's what we're thinking, because you just get attacked. You say, well, you don't know. You've got male privilege. You've got white privilege. You've got all this. You don't understand any of this, any of these struggles that we've had. And so we just sit back and we say, well, okay, we'll just keep our mouth shut and, as my dad would say, keep our nose to the grindstone and keep working and not worry about it. Quite frankly, it sucks.
Yeah. I mean, I was introduced to white male privilege at a very young age because, I grew up living in a trailer until I was about 10 or 11. My dad had to work about 16 hours a day. And, had to drop out of school when he was about 13, 14, had very little school, and he had to work on a farm with his father and couldn't actually read. So yeah, I had a ton of white privilege when I was a kid in that scenario. But I think, the big problem is, like, when we read the definition of toxic masculinity as defined by, academia and the media, is that it's such a small percentage of people who are making these rules and getting offended, and then they broadcast to everybody else, you need to be offended by this. Because, I've got a lot of friends, various religions, nationalities, races and stuff, and they don't have a problem with me being white. They don't have a problem with white people. It's the media and academia who is telling us we need to have this white guilt, we need to have this male guilt, and it's such a small percentage, probably less than 1%, probably far less than 1% of people telling everybody else what they need to be offended by, whereas the majority of people, it doesn't matter which side of the political aisle you're on, just genuinely want to get along, but there are people stoking the fires to try and make being a white male bad, when in reality, the vast majority of females, vast majority of other races have no problems with white males. No. It's just the people who have the money, whether it be in Hollywood, the people who buy the advertising space, try to preach that, white males are bad, yet guaranteed every single one of these companies, down to the last one, are run by old white males.
Yeah. That's totally true. And like you telling the story of your father over in England, I remember my father telling me the story of his father, whom I'm named after. And so my grandfather, who died before I was born,
he was called Shepherd?
That was his name, Shepherd. He couldn't read or write.
Right.
Couldn't read or write. He was a wallpaper hanger and worked tirelessly to provide for his family. There was very little money for the family. The story that I heard, and I believe it because I've actually seen the house. My grandfather built the house my father grew up in with his own two hands. And it wasn't a great looking house. I mean, you're talking about a 2-3 room house, no indoor plumbing, things like that. So I didn't come from white privilege. There was no, handed down wealth or anything. My father, very intelligent man, very wise man, didn't go to college, didn't have a college degree, worked his whole life, and even to this day still works. He's 82 years old and is still working. And, there was no privilege there. But I do remember, in not trying to dig too much into the race thing, but I got to share this story. I remember being a young kid, I don't know, I was probably 8 or 9, when my dad told me this story. But my dad was on the basketball team in his junior high school. And they rode the bus to, some basketball game. And on the way back, the coach of the team said, well, we're going to stop off at a diner and we're going to eat. And my dad didn't have any money to be able to eat at the diner. And so he told the coach, I don't have any money to be able to eat. He said, no, the school's going to pay for your food. And my dad's like, oh, okay. And I mean, today we think about going out to eat, driving through a drive-through. That's just commonplace. But back in those days, going out to eat, that was an event.
Right.
So my dad goes in and they get the food, and there was a black kid on the basketball team. And they told the black kid that he had to sit on the bus and eat his dinner.
Wow.
And my dad didn't like that. And so when my dad got his food, he went and sat with that kid on the bus and ate dinner with him. And everybody on the team ostracized my dad because he went and sat on the bus with them. So when I hear this, toxic masculinity, this white privilege thing, I think back to that story, because that's the way I was raised.
Right.
And I think most people were actually raised that way. They know that, yes, you've got people out there that have crazy beliefs and all that. And it's that bad apple argument. There's always 2 or 3 bad apples, right? But that's not the majority. That's the minority.
Yeah. Now, quick question. Was this a 1A school? Because your dad's about 5'7". How did he make the basketball team?
Well,
or did he shrink?
Well, you got to remember, this was junior high.
Right.
This was junior high, so
okay. Right.
I don't know how tall he was, and I guarantee. But you know what? I have seen my dad throw a basketball, and he could make shots. But yeah, he wasn't going to go NBA or anything like that.
It's definitely not genetic, because I've seen you try and throw trash in there.
Absolutely.
Trash from like 1 yard away, and
it doesn't happen.
Hit yourself in the face.
But you also got to remember, this is in the middle of Kansas too,
right.
So it's not like that's where all the NBA players
we had like a goat playing point guard. Yeah,
exactly.
Well, I think exactly what you're saying about toxic masculinity. There are always, in every segment of society, a few people who do bad things, say bad things, that get the most attention, and people attribute their attributes to the whole of that specific part of society. And so, you get a few bad white men, a few bad black men, a few bad Asians, a few bad women. It starts, the more that spreads around, it starts becoming a stereotype. And the more the media and ads push that. It becomes a stereotype. Going back a couple of years, and I can't remember whether this was a Super Bowl ad. I think the first time it was shown, it was actually during a football game. It might have been a playoff game, but Gillette came up with this,
the razor company,
right?
Right?
Yeah, the best men can be. And Gillette is owned by Procter & Gamble, and before this ad came out, there had been commentary about, a lot of P&G ads had started kind of turning this corner, kind of changing the views of men, the roles of men, but, kind of almost putting this affirmative action type role in these adverts of stuff that things men wouldn't normally do and stuff that women wouldn't normally do. And the Gillette ad, which caused a lot of controversy and a lot of people would actually drop the product, and I actually dropped the product for this reason as well, was because they ran a 2-minute commercial, and it was basically like 5 or 6 different segments of about 20-25 seconds each of just purely white men doing bad, horrible things, being racist, being sexist. And then the people who were correcting them in the commercial, it was women, it was minorities, and it's like, only white men are bad. That was the message through the commercial, but then they tried to play it off and just be the best you can be. But then why not mix it up? I mean, there are plenty of, you go through the news, there are plenty of women who, abuse their kids. There's plenty of minorities who commit crime. And yes, there's plenty of white men who are sexist, racist, and everything else. But if you really want to truly send the message, be the best you can be, then send it out to everybody. Then nobody gets offended. Everybody gets the message, and it doesn't look like you're targeting one group. And
sure,
it's
totally makes sense, because it's very easy, and I guess in the realm that we're in now, that and I'm using air quotes now, that poor white guy, right? And most people are going to say, oh yeah, let's really feel bad for the white guy. And we're not sitting here trying to feel bad for the white guys, but we're so, I guess, I hate to use the word afraid, but we're so afraid of saying anything that is going to offend somebody else that we just, we sit back, we remain silent, we say, okay, well, we're just going to go through our normal day-to-day stuff. We don't really want to hurt anybody. We don't want to offend anybody. But we also don't have a channel to complain. We don't have a voice to get out there and say, hey, we're not all bad. We understand when people go through hardships and heartaches and things like that. But, just let us do what we want to do. And don't take something like a razor company that obviously, I'm guessing Gillette, by the way, and we didn't research this, but I'm guessing Gillette probably sells razors to women too.
Yeah.
But that they didn't target women in that ad.
But on that point,
it was just men.
Can I interject then?
Sure.
For pretty much the same product, but with a pink handle, they actually charge $2 more on average for the women's product. And so they're talking about equality, but they charge more for women's razors, the exact same product, than men's razors.
Yeah, see, that's ridiculous. And I don't know anything about, a men's razor versus a women's razor, but if it's the same razor blade, I mean, it's razor blades. Why
changed the color of the handle.
Yeah, why are they charging more?
Right.
I mean, that's
I can tell you why. It's because, the majority of men, shave at some point, but they use trimmers, they use razors. But women, for their legs, under their arms, have to really use kind of bladed razors. So women are almost kind of forced in a way to having to use, razors, razor blades, right. Whereas men aren't. And so because they know that this is a necessity for women and women have to buy them, they put them a higher price. Whereas with men, if it got too expensive, we'd be like, dang it, I'm just going to buy a trimmer. I'm just going to buy a, battery or electric shaver and just go with that. I'm not going to pay this much money for this. But with women, they know they can get away with it because women don't really have the alternative outside of, expensive waxing and depilation creams and all this other stuff to get rid of the hair.
And you could almost go in this COVID season that we're in now. I saw an article about you probably should not have a beard to be able to wear your mask safely, because the beard is going to push the mask out a little bit, so you need to start shaving. Almost makes me wonder, are companies like Gillette trying to go to the CDC and pony up some money and say, hey, we got to go back because, beards are popular now.
Right.
If you look back in history, presidents and men, they all had beards until you got to the point to where you had the disposable razor, and then all of a sudden men started shaving more, and now it's popular to have a beard, and now companies like Gillette might be saying, well, hey, we need to sell more razors, so this is a fine opportunity for us to say, hey, hey guys, all you guys that have these beards, you need to start shaving them off. And so you need to go out and buy our razors to keep these beards clean, because you've got to wear your mask, and that mask has got to fit a certain way.
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, that sounds a little bit conspiracy theory.
That's exactly what I was going to say. But you have to remember, back in that period when men pretty much all had beards and moustaches, they also mostly wore hats as well. So it's like this conspiracy that the razor companies and the hairdressers got together and said, we need to change things here because we're not making any money.
Yeah.
I made $4 last week. We need to change.
Right. Yeah. We got to do some lobbying there with Congress and get that squared away. So if we look towards and we talked about Gillette and their advertising, right? But if we also look towards movies, right, and trying to promote that healthy masculinity, stepping back and letting women take the lead, which we've said, what, strong women, we're all for you. Y'all are doing great out there, no problem there, but you also just can't continuously step on men. The same way we're stepping aside and saying, hey, lady, you want to take the lead here? We're good with that. But you can't push men out of the way just to attain that.
Yeah. And I mean, I have no problem, I'm pretty sure, most men wouldn't. I have no problem with being a kept man. I mean, my good friend Martha Stewart, I mean, she's old, but she can cook and she has lots of money. If she wants me to be her, I wouldn't mind having her as a sugar mama. I'd gladly live there and just watch it. Yeah.
You could be the pool boy.
Yeah, I don't care. I don't care. But, I think, in ads and movies now, they're trying to change the perception of what masculinity is. And, normally when you try and change a society's way of thinking, it takes place over decades.
Sure.
But I feel that this has taken a very sharp turn. This has been a very steep curve in trying to persuade basically the general public what a man's roles are and what is offensive about being male, because it's like when we started off, we said that, we hadn't heard of the terms mansplaining or toxic masculinity before, the past few years. But I think within that same time frame, advertisements and movies have, gone very heavily and very quickly to change the role of males. I mean, you watch a commercial now, and I actually started making a note of it after I read an article online about how many white males now are in commercials where they actually are the lead role, where they're not demasculated. They don't take away the masculinity. You've got men in sweater vests, kind of skinny in sweater vests, looking like, I guess traditionally what would call the people who used to hang out in Starbucks.
Right.
Those type of people. And nothing against the people who hang out in Starbucks. But it's one of those things where now it's like a woman has to take the lead role, or it has to be a minority in the lead role. And there are very few commercials, I would say less than probably 1 in 5, where a white male that would have been used maybe 10 years ago is actually the lead role in these commercials. Any lead role of a male now, he has to be slightly feminized, non-threatening, and really kind of toe the line. And if there's a woman in the commercial, he instantly becomes the idiot. And one thing I noticed, it almost doesn't matter what color the male is, because if you have a black and a white male in the commercial, if a woman appears, both of those men are idiots.
Yeah, they become the buffoon.
Yeah.
And that is so easy to do now. It's with all of the advertisements, all of the Hollywood, the man becomes the buffoon. And this one's going to hurt a little bit, but our beloved movie franchise Star Wars.
Well, before you go there...
we're not going there yet.
Before you go there, think about how in the last 2-3 years horror movies have changed. Now, I know you're not a big horror movie fan. I really am.
Yeah.
I watch...
So I got to defer to you on the horror movie
Now I watch...
I don't like them.
Now, I watch I don't know, maybe 2 or 3 horror movies a week. You know, it's always been my thing, watching horror movies. It's my favorite genre, I think, overall. And, you know, I've noticed that, you know, more and more that women have become, you know, the main antagonist against, you know, evil entities and everything else. And the men have become all the screaming, not level-headed, you know, characters. And, you know, it used to be a point, if you go back to the movies, the 70s, the 80s, or the 90s, the horror movies, you remember, it would be like the girl, like, hears a noise outside, and she'd open the window, stick her head out, and look slowly to one side, look the other side, and then, you know, maybe get her head chopped off or something, or she'd hear a noise, and just go outside, you know, in her nightgown, you know, to find out what the noise was. But now that's changed. I mean, now the horror movies... You know, I've seen in the last 2-3 years, that doesn't happen anymore. It's the men who make the stupid mistakes. And again, it doesn't matter what color the male is. You know, that they're just buffoons, you know, that they're devoid of logic. It's like they hear a noise outside, but let's go outside in our underwear and not take a weapon or any of this kind of stuff. And it's the women who are always making the decisions and leading them out of trouble. And it's, you know, it's not realistic. I mean, at home, if you heard a noise outside and voices, you know, it's not going to be the first one off the couch gets to go and see what's going on.
Right.
You're not going to go send your daughter or your wife out there.
Absolutely not.
I'm going to grab the gun or I'm going to grab a knife and I'm going to go out there. I'm not going to expect somebody else to go out there for me, you know, because at the end of the day, if it comes down to anything involving conflict, you want the person who is most likely to survive the conflict going out there to confront the danger. And that's something which has become now unrealistic in not just horror movies, but now we can switch back to our favorite franchise and address that issue here.
Yeah, and this one's going to hurt a little bit because you and I both grew up loving Star Wars. We've talked about it a little bit on the podcast before. You know, we are big Star Wars fans. And the first 3 movies, great movies. Then we had the prequels, and we'll leave it at that. And then we had the release of the sequels.
Right.
And we were extremely excited about this. You know, we looked at it that, okay, well, we got the Disney machine behind this. They're going to pump all kinds of money in it. George Lucas isn't going to let us down. And then we go see the first movie and we say, okay, if you look back at the first movies and you got Luke Skywalker and all of a sudden, you know, yeah, he has the, you know, the family ability with the Force, and so you kind of get that, but Obi-Wan's kind of training him, send him off to Dagobah. He's, you know, hanging out with Yoda, and he's figuring all this stuff out. You're not quite sure what the time frame is when he's actually doing his training. But then you get into
I think it was 1979, 1980.
Well, yeah. Well, we don't know exactly how long he spent on Dagobah.
How long ago in a galaxy far, far away it was.
Something like that. Something like that, right? But But then all of a sudden, we're presented with Rey, who magically, and I use that term heavily, magically just can wield a lightsaber and has these force powers, and everyone around other than Rey is just worthless.
Yeah. And I think
absolutely worthless.
I think the one thing which maybe saved that in episode 9 was finding out who her grandfather was, because he was obviously, one of the strongest Sith of all time. So she had a great pull to inherit, just like Luke Skywalker inherited his stuff from his father. Darth Vader, Anakin. You understand why he had such strong force powers, and in some ways you can kind of understand why Rey got a pretty heavy thing, because again, you look at episode 9 when he lifts all these Imperial starships out of the water and stuff. It's like we'd never seen any of that type of use of power, because let's be honest, I mean, it would have ruined the original movies. I think in the last trilogy they went too far in the demonstration of the powers of the Force. I think it kind of ruined it. To me, it's like a kind of semi-superpower, which, you can use to give you an advantage, but they made it like a superpower to the point where if you really had those powers, you'd be at 100% indestructible and undefeatable.
Yeah, if you could do that. But then the dumpster fire that episode 8 was, if you look at that, it was all about how the men in that movie were idiots and the women were in control of everything. I remember going to see episode 8, and I was sitting next to my wife, and when the movie ended, she looked over at me and she said, "What did you think?" And I looked at her, I looked her square in the eyes, and I said, "That sucked. That was the worst Star Wars movie," and that's a bold statement.
Now, didn't she also think that you looked like you'd been crying as well?
I probably was. I probably was crying. I was so disappointed because look, episode 7, not great, but not bad. Lots of fan service. The Falcon's back. You see Han and Chewie. Han dies. Whatever, but. And then you get to the end, and it's like Luke sitting there like, "Oh, I'm sitting here on an island, and I haven't done anything." Yeah. But you got Leia, you got all that. So yes, lots of fan
milking
service.
The tit of some alien seal.
Well, no, that's 8, not 7.
Well, I was talking about 7. Yeah, that's when you first see him back in there.
And so when I watched 8, I was so disappointed because I remember. Even seeing the prequels and even episode 1 as looking back as bad as that was, I still saw it probably 4 or 5 times in the theater. I mean, it was a Star Wars movie. 2 and 3, same thing. I mean, but 8, I've seen twice.
The second time with me and our friend Eric.
Right.
It's only the fact that Eric drove. That was the only reason I didn't walk out of that movie. I hated it so much.
Yeah. Just to clarify, when the new movies have came out, I've always taken my family and we go see the movie, and then you and I and Eric, we would always go see the movie.
And you'd fall asleep.
Either the next day or the day before, whatever. And yes, a lot of times I'd fall asleep.
Yeah.
But I totally agree with you that when 8 came out and I saw it with my family, and that was one of those where I saw it with my family before I saw it with you guys, I thought, okay, well, let me just go see it again with you guys. Maybe I missed something. And I watched it again, and I was just so disappointed. And like you say, if it wasn't for Eric driving, we would have walked out of it.
I'd have gone next door and watched the new Miley Cyrus movie, to be honest. But the thing is, I don't understand, because it doesn't have to be this way, because you look at Rogue One, all right? It's got a lead female character. But
Yes.
that movie was perfectly balanced. It had minorities all the way through it. You had a lead
Certainly
female
did.
character, but they balanced it perfectly. There was no PC stuff in there, and
Right.
it was a fantastic movie. I mean,
And not only that, it wasn't some kind of pandering towards her as a female character.
Right.
You attached to her. You said, Jen Erso, that is a great character. You were hoping that she ended up better after the movie. Of course, spoiler alert if you haven't seen Rogue One, which I can't imagine anybody listening to this right now hadn't seen it, but they all die in the end, and you actually feel like, here's a character that I can actually attach to, and I wouldn't care if she's male, female, black, white, it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
It was the character.
Now, you do find, though, that, in those Star Wars movies, like all the way through, all three trilogies of it, that if you notice, the clothing between the men and the women, they pretty much wore the same stuff. I mean, Rey pretty much wore the same stuff as Luke Skywalker first wore. So, I mean, it's like a unisex kind of clothing line. And it's funny because...
except for Return of the Jedi with Princess Leia.
Right, yeah.
Well, that's still my
different.
favorite Star Wars
Well,
outfit.
Yeah,
let's be honest.
Yeah,
let's be honest.
That's a little bit different.
That's fantastic.
But,
rest in peace, Carrie Fisher. But wow.
Yeah. But, I do think there is a deliberate attempt, to masculate a lot of women's clothing and effeminate a lot of men's clothing now. I think it started back when the man purse came out and, tight skinny jeans and all this stuff. Now, tight skinny jeans wasn't a new thing because you go back to kind of glam rock in the 70s and the hair bands of the 80s. Those bands wore, tight pants and all this stuff.
Yeah, the leather pants and all that good stuff.
But that wasn't for general consumption. You didn't tend to have too many people walking around in the streets past a certain age wearing clothes like that. But now, it's hard sometimes looking at, how some women dress and, wondering why they want to kind of defer or get rid of the femininity, that they see femininity as a weakness, and yet they're pushing towards equality, but don't try and become equal by trying to become more masculine.
Sure.
As we said to begin with, you can be a strong female, and we will celebrate and applaud you all day long, but don't try and be equal by trying to be more mannish. And the same thing, if you're a man, you can change and be more sensitive, not be sexist, not be racist, but you don't have to become feminine, to kind of balance out those things and get rid of those things which I guess were truly toxic before. Right. Being a man is not being toxic. There are toxic parts of femininity and masculinity, but you can get rid of those without losing the identity of being a man and a woman.
Sure, and you have to go back to that spectrum idea. That's what I look at with so many of these problems that we have, because we get so far on one side or the other of the spectrum, and I would like to think that most people actually think about the fact that they're somewhere in the middle. They're reasonable enough to realize that there's certain things on one side, certain things on the other side. Let's be reasonable. Let's be logical. Let's think about this and meet somewhere in the middle. Just kind of like the feminazis. Feminism. Look, I get the fact that women want to be proud of being a woman, and they should be proud to be a woman, and most men are going to support women, like we've talked about, strong women and everything, but just being a feminazi and telling men that they're terrible because they're not a woman is the wrong way to go.
Right.
It's the absolute wrong way to go.
I think, people criticize, the beauty industry because it's, at least traditionally, mostly filled with very skinny, tall white women.
Sure.
Yet they miss out on the fact that the majority of the fashion industry, whether it be magazines or clothing designers,
right,
have being females. You have a few exceptions, but for the most point, especially nowadays, these are females driving this market and this fashion industry, and yet for whatever reason it's men who get the criticism for women having this image put upon them that you have to live up to this unrealistic image. But you and I mean, we don't like 60-pound women, who, with no curves and all this. It's not men who are driving this unrealistic image, for women. Yeah, we don't want you to be 400 pounds, but we don't want you to be 40 pounds either.
Sure.
Somewhere kind of in the middle, and men have a, sliding scale of what they prefer. But, it wasn't men, for the most part, who put this unrealistic perception, femininity, or what it means to be a woman, or you're only attractive if you look this way, because we didn't pay any interest to it. We don't care.
Not only that, but last time I checked, I don't think there's too many men that write articles for Cosmopolitan magazine.
Right.
These are magazines written by women for women, and so they're having the models on the cover, whatever. Yeah. They're writing these articles about, here's this diet, here's these clothes you should wear, all that. We didn't do any of that. But they would attack somebody like Hugh Hefner, who puts out Playboy, and then say, well, this is what you're trying to project to men is what a perfect woman is. I'm like, well, no. These women are having pictures taken of themselves. They want to be models, and nude, not nude, doesn't actually matter. It's just a magazine. But you're putting out it Cosmopolitan. That's the only one I can think of. I know there's several other
Vogue,
magazines.
Famous one.
Vogue, there you go. But then all of a sudden we got to that, well, don't body shame me.
Right.
I can be big and I can still be beautiful. I think Dove did a little deal about that. It's like, okay, well, no man said anything about this.
Right.
This is all on y'all.
Yeah.
So why are you attacking us? You're the ones that put all these, like you say, these thin, and God, I hate to use this term, but anorexic kind of women on this. You're the ones that pick these women to take these pictures of and say, this is what's beautiful, that these are the clothes, these are the runway shows that you're putting on, and you have these women that are just ridiculously thin, and you then turn around and you have all these other women looking to them saying, well, this is what men think is beautiful. No men were sitting around that table saying, well, hang on a second, we didn't say this.
Right.
This is all on you guys.
But if you look back at, I don't know, maybe swimsuit models and Playboy, the women in those magazines look nothing like the women in Vogue and Cosmopolitan.
Sure.
And, I can't remember which actress said it, but there was a quote, and this was like over 20 years ago. I think I was still living in England. And she said, whenever I skip through, the pages of Vogue, I feel like the message is, if you can't fit yourself in between the gap between the sofa and the wall, you're a fat bitch.
Oh, wow. I totally do not doubt that.
Yeah.
Don't doubt that at all.
Yeah. So, I mean, at the end of the day, we're not going to be pressured by this new change because we're of a certain age, but I kind of fear for kids who are getting indoctrinated going through the educational system, because it is academia and movies and ads, which, kids through phones and everything else are very addicted to, and that's where they get most of their learning from.
Well, don't forget about the fact that they go through that in high school, and then when they go to higher education, they get away from their parents. So their parents can't tell them, this is crazy, don't believe this. They get away from their parents, they go to college, and then they're hit with the social media, and they don't have their parents there to explain to them, this is BS and this is not BS.
Yeah.
And then they walk right out of college with this crazy thought of the way the world really is.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not ashamed of being male, and I mean, obviously you're not, and, most of the
Well,
people
I don't know. Maybe
well,
you're trying to talk me into being ashamed of being a male. I'm having second thoughts.
Well,
now.
I actually, again, I read a bit of an article the other day about not just misgendering, that people are offended if you declare yourself as male or female. And there was an article which I think was kind of part joking, part not, and it was to stop saying good boy or good girl to your dog, and, because you're designating a gender to your pet, and your pet may be confused and might not identify with that gender. Now, I think that was kind of it. It wasn't on Babylon Bee, but it was kind of like part serious,
Sure.
part not. But then I did read a while later a serious article saying that, declaring you're male or female at some point may be considered as offensive as trying to assume somebody's gender, that you can't say I am a man, you can't say I'm a woman, because it's going to offend those people who are maybe confused about what their gender is and make them feel isolated. So, I mean, I truly hope it doesn't go that way, but given the way things have gone the last 2-3 years, I wouldn't put it past.
Right. Ironically, in this country, we've always had freedom of speech. And of course, freedom of speech is one of those things that you got to be careful with. Just because you say something and you have that so-called freedom doesn't mean that there's not consequences behind what you say. So if we continue down that path and just realize that we can have dialogues about things, we can actually talk about things, I think we'll be okay.
Yeah.
But if you start silencing the freedom of speech, then we're going back to what we fought for in this country 200 and some odd years ago, of not being able to say what we want to say.
Right. And there was, the whole thing about free speech, the common example, I think, which was used for about 50 years was you can have freedom of speech, but something like you can't shout fire in a crowded movie theater.
Right.
Now, when the movie Backdraft came out, it's a very popular movie.
Yep. Love that movie.
People put this to the test, and every time something happened, people in the audience would shout out, fire, fire, kind of thing. And it was to prove the point that everything is circumstantial. There's always going to be a loophole where you can say something. There's going to be times you can't say something. But again, I think it comes down to this fact that probably less than 1% of the population are really that offended by stuff we find ridiculous. Now, there is a growing segment of society who are kind of pushing, this agenda where we have to kind of keep in line with this non-misgendering and all this other stuff. But again, it's such a small part that, really if we ignored it, it would almost kind of go away, or they'd just be, making noises by themselves in the corner. But it has such a wide audience because of the media and through Hollywood that it's thrown in everybody's faces, and they're trying to convince us that this has to be the new normal.
Yep, exactly. And with that, thank you for tuning into this episode of The Wolf and the Shepherd. We certainly appreciate all of you listeners supporting us through all this, and we'll catch you on the next one.